I should have known something was wrong the moment Mason walked through the door. He wasn't late, Mason was never late, but there was something off. The way he moved, the way he didn't look at me, the way he exhaled just a little too hard when he set his keys on the counter. Mason? I called softly, trying to gauge his mood. He ignored me. Just walked to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, twisted the cap off with slow, deliberate movements. I watched his knuckles tighten around the plastic, the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched like he was grinding his teeth. Something was wrong. I set my phone down on the kitchen table and stood. Long day? He took a slow sip of water. Yeah. That was it. Just yeah. No teasing about his crew at work, no venting about the supply delays, no smirk as he tried to get me to crack a joke. Just a single, clipped word. I swallowed hard. Maybe this wasn't the right time. Maybe I should wait until he was in a better mood. But I had already waited too long. Mason, I started, my voice tight. Can we talk? His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. He still wasn't looking at me. What about? I took a deep breath, wrapping my arms around myself. Something I should have told you a long time ago. That made him pause. He finally turned to me, his dark eyes unreadable, his face a perfect mask of indifference. But I knew better. Mason wasn't the type to explode. He was the type to bury things deep, let them fester in silence until they rotted from the inside out. I opened my mouth, then shut it again. How did I even begin? I had practiced this conversation in my head 100 times, but now that I was here, standing in front of him, every single carefully chosen word collapsed into itself. My throat felt tight. I married you because I was in love with someone else. The second the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Mason blinked. Once. Twice. His expression didn't change, but I felt the shift in the room. Like all the air had been sucked out. I rushed to explain. It wasn't like that. It wasn't because I didn't care about you, I did. But I was hurt, Mason. I was so hurt. And when I met you, you were safe. You were kind. You were everything he wasn't. And I thought, I swallowed, my voice trembling now. I thought if I married you, I would finally stop loving him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Mason let out a soft, humorless laugh. Wow. I stepped forward, my hands shaking. I love you now, Mason. I swear to God, I love you now. He finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach drop. He had already made up his mind. Before I could say another word, before I could explain that it was him I wanted, that my heart had shifted long ago. Mason turned, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. He left before I could tell him the part that mattered most. Before I could tell him that my ex had come back. That I had seen him. That everything Mason thought was true, was only half the story. And now, I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to explain. Mason didn't come home that night. Or the next. At first, I told myself he just needed time. Mason wasn't the type to lash out, to break things, to scream. He was the kind of man who took his pain and carried it quietly, letting it settle deep into his bones where no one could see. But by the third day, I knew this wasn't just time. This was something else. I called him. No answer. I texted. Mason, please. Let's talk. Delivered. Read. Ignored. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone like it might magically ring, my heart twisting every time the screen stayed dark. I wanted to believe he was just angry, that he was thinking things through, that he was deciding if he could forgive me. But the truth was, Mason wasn't coming home. And that terrified me. Because Mason had never not come home. I tried calling his best friend, Jordan, but he gave me the same quiet, measured response. Haven't heard from him. Lie. Mason and Jordan were practically brothers. If Mason wasn't answering me, he sure as hell was answering Jordan. Panic started clawing up my throat. I knew what Mason had to be thinking. He thought I had been pining for my ex this entire time. That our entire marriage was a lie. But it wasn't. I had to make him see that. I was about to leave, to go looking for him, to do something, when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. For a second, I thought, Mason, but when I answered, the voice on the other end was the last one I expected. Hey, Hannah. I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse spiking. Ethan. My ex. The man I had once thought I would spend my life with. The man who had walked out on me like I was nothing. The man who had shattered me so completely, I had run straight into Mason's arms to prove, to myself, to him, to the entire damn world, that I had moved on. But I hadn't heard from him in years. Not since the night he left. Not until now. I heard about Mason, Ethan said, his voice smooth, calculated. I just wanted to check on you. Check on me. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Since when do you check on me? There was a pause. Then a sigh. Look, I know I hurt you. And I know it's not my place to show up now, but maybe it is. Maybe this was supposed to happen. My fingers tightened around the phone. Don't. Hannah, he murmured, voice low and knowing, you and I both know why you married him. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the heat rising to my face. I had been so sure Mason wouldn't find out. That I had buried my past deep enough that it couldn't touch us. But then Mason had walked out before I could finish explaining. And now Ethan was here, pressing at the cracks like he had never left. I don't know what you think this is, I said, my voice shaking, but you don't get to do this. You don't get to show up now. You didn't even ask how I found out, Ethan said, a quiet amusement lacing his words. My stomach dropped. How had he found out? Mason hadn't told anyone. Not his family, not his friends. He would have shut down before saying a word. So how the hell did Ethan know? Something cold settled in my gut. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something else. You're lying, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan chuckled, low and knowing. Am I? And just like that, the pieces started clicking into place. Mason hadn't come home. Mason hadn't answered. Because Mason wasn't just mad. He knew something I didn't. And Ethan. Ethan had something to do with it. Mason didn't come home that night. Or the next. By the third day, the silence became unbearable. The weight of his absence pressed against my chest like a boulder, making it hard to breathe. Every creak of the house, every distant sound of a car passing outside sent my heart into overdrive, hoping, praying, that it was him. But it never was. I called him. No answer. I texted. Mason, please. Just talk to me. Delivered. Read. Ignored. That was when the panic set in. Mason wasn't just mad. He wasn't just trying to cool off. Mason was gone. And I had no idea if he was ever coming back. I paced the house, replaying everything in my mind. The look on his face when I told him the truth. The way his body tensed, like I had just knocked the air out of his lungs. The sound of the door closing behind him before I could finish. He had only heard half the story. The wrong half. And now, he was out there believing the worst. But the part that haunted me the most? Ethan's voice on the phone. You didn't even ask how I found out. A chill crept down my spine. That smugness. That certainty. Ethan had planned this. I grabbed my phone again, scrolling through my call history until I reached the unknown number from the night before. My thumb hovered over it. Don't do it. I ignored the voice in my head and pressed call. The phone rang once. Twice. Then he answered. Didn't think I'd hear from you so soon, Ethan murmured, his voice laced with amusement. I gritted my teeth. What did you do? A low chuckle. Straight to the point. I always liked that about you. What did you do, Ethan? A long pause. Then, casually, I just told Mason the truth. My heart slammed against my ribs. No. You told him your version of the truth. Another chuckle. Is there a difference? I clenched my fist so tightly my nails dug into my palm. You made him think I'd been lying to him this whole time. Ethan let out a dramatic sigh. Come on, Hannah. Don't make me out to be the bad guy here. I just told him what he deserved to know. That you saw me. That you didn't tell him. That maybe, deep down, you never really let me go. My breath hitched. That's not true. Isn't it? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to keep my emotions in check. I don't love you, Ethan. I haven't in a long time. Silence. Then, his voice dropped, lower, more serious. Then why did you come to see me? My throat tightened. It had been a mistake. A moment of weakness. A ghost from my past reaching out, and I had been stupid enough to answer. I had told myself it was closure. That I needed to look him in the eyes one last time to remind myself of what I had escaped. But I should have known better. I should have known Ethan never let go of anything. Still there, he drawled. I forced my voice to stay steady. I saw you once. That doesn't mean anything. Ethan hummed like he was considering my words. Maybe not to you. But to Mason? He let out a low whistle. That man worships you, Hannah. Imagine how it felt to hear his perfect wife was sitting across from her ex, keeping secrets. Must have hit him like a truck. I swallowed against the lump in my throat. You wanted him to leave me. Ethan didn't deny it. Instead, he said, do you really think Mason is the kind of man who just walks away without a plan? A sharp chill ran through me. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan sked. You don't get it yet, do you? A pause. A loaded, suffocating pause. Then. Hannah, Mason didn't just leave. Something about the way he said it sent ice-cold terror straight through my veins. I gripped the phone tighter. Where is he? Ethan chuckled darkly. That's the real question, isn't it? The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. Mason wasn't just gone. Something was wrong. And I had no idea what I was about to uncover. I sat frozen, my breath shallow, the dead silence of the call ringing louder in my ears than Ethan's final words. Mason didn't just leave. The walls of my house felt like they were closing in, suffocating me with every second that passed without an answer. Ethan knew something. Something he wasn't saying. And Mason was out there, somewhere, believing I had betrayed him. I couldn't let this be the end. I grabbed my keys and drove. The road to Mason's cabin stretched out like a black void in the night. Tall trees loomed on either side, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky, making the headlights feel useless against the pressing darkness. When I finally pulled up, his truck was still there, parked haphazardly like he had been in a hurry. But the cabin itself was dark. I hesitated only for a second before pushing the door open. Inside, the air was thick with whiskey and something heavier, something almost electric, like a storm had passed through and left the charge behind. Mason was sitting at the small wooden table, a glass in his hand, his eyes staring into nothing. He didn't even flinch when I walked in. Mason. My voice cracked, barely a whisper. Nothing. I stepped closer. Please. Just let me explain. A bitter smile ghosted over his lips, but he still didn't look at me. What's left to explain? His voice was hoarse, like he had been drinking and not speaking for days. I swallowed hard. Ethan called me. He told me he spoke to you. Mason finally turned his head, and the look in his eyes nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. It wasn't just anger. It was devastation. "Did you love him?" he asked, his voice quiet but deadly. I blinked, caught off guard. "Mason. Did you love him?" I sucked in a shaky breath. "A long time ago. But not now. Not for a long time." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh and downed the rest of his drink. "Funny. That's not what Ethan said." I stiffened. "What did he tell you?" Mason slammed the empty glass onto the table, his patience snapping. "That you met up with him. That you wanted closure, but he could tell you still had feelings for him. That maybe, deep down, you wished he had never left." "No," my voice trembled. "That's not true. I saw him once. Just once. And it meant nothing." Mason's jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break. "Then why didn't you tell me?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. Because I had kept it from him. I had buried it, convinced it wasn't worth bringing up, convinced it was a part of my past best left in the dark. And now, that decision had cost me everything. "I didn't tell you," I whispered, "because I was afraid. Afraid of exactly this." Mason exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair, his entire body coiled like a spring about to snap. "Do you have any idea what it felt like to hear it from him? To find out from him that my wife had sat across from the man she swore she was over? That she never thought I was worth telling?" Tears blurred my vision. "Mason, I loved you, Hannah." His voice cracked, and it hit me like a physical blow. "I gave you everything. And now I have to wonder if I was just a consolation prize." I couldn't hold back the sob that tore from my throat. "You weren't." I stepped forward, desperate to touch him, to make him see. "You weren't, Mason. You were the only thing that made me feel whole again. You are the only thing that matters." His breath hitched, and for a moment, I saw the war raging behind his eyes. But then, the sound of tires crunching gravel outside. A car. We both turned. Then, a knock. Mason's eyes flickered with something dark. He knew. We both knew. I ran to the door and wrenched it open. Ethan stood there, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the place, a smirk curling his lips. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he drawled. My stomach twisted. "What the hell are you doing here?" Mason's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his presence radiating pure, unfiltered rage. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here." Ethan barely spared him a glance. "I wanted to make sure Hannah was okay." He looked at me, eyes gleaming. "We had such a nice conversation the other night. I figured she might need a friend." Mason took a step forward. I could feel the anger rolling off him in waves. "Leave. Now." Ethan sighed, shaking his head. "You know, Mason, I never meant to break up your marriage. But I figured you deserved the truth. It's not my fault if you can't handle it." I turned to Mason, my heart racing. "Don't listen to him. He's trying to manipulate you." Ethan smirked. "Oh, sweetheart. You already did that yourself." Mason snapped. Before I could react, he lunged. He grabbed Ethan by the collar, shoving him back against the wall so hard the wooden beams rattled. Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time. "You think this is a game?" Mason growled. "You think you can just walk in here, mess with my wife, and get away with it?" Ethan chuckled, but there was a nervous edge to it now. "Relax, man. I was just..." Mason shoved him harder. "You ruined her for me. You made sure I'd never be able to look at her the same way again." His voice broke, and my heart shattered. Ethan's expression shifted, just slightly. Like he knew he had pushed too far. All right, he muttered. "Let me go." Mason held him there for another long second, then released him with a rough shove. Ethan straightened his shirt, throwing me one last look. "Guess I'll see you around, Hannah." Then, he was gone. The second the door slammed shut, I turned to Mason, desperate. "Please. Don't let him win." But Mason's eyes were hollow. "I don't think Ethan won," he said softly. "I think we both lost." And just like that, I knew. Mason wasn't coming back. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. And this time, there was no taking it back.